On you.
Hey, everybody. Welcome once again to another episode of the Cult of Copy Show. I'm your host, the Reverend Dr. Sir Colin D. Terrio. And as you know, if you've seen previous episodes, uh, this is the show where we talk about persuasion and influence and manipulation and mind control and all that fun stuff that you can do on your own if you watch our show for fun and profit. This week, we are continuing our ongoing series talking about cognitive biases and uh, logical fallacies and decision heuristic errors that we can use to um, predictably elicit the behavior that we want from people we interact with. Now, I know that sounds sinister to some people, but really, I guess the easy way of saying it is that we are going to be talking about how to use psychology to get people to do what you want and who can't use more of that in their lives. If you want to learn more about the Cult of Copy, we have a website at cultofcopy.com. Our YouTube channel is youtube.com/cultofcopy, where you can see the previous 29 episodes of the show that we've recorded so far. I would love it if you did. Leave us some comments. But also, we record this show live. So if you are watching this live as we are streaming it, please do leave some comments in the little text box, because Zane monitors those and interrupts the show with them so we can chit-chat and exchange ideas. Although I know it's Black Friday, so I don't anticipate many people sitting on YouTube awaiting my show. But if you're here, feel free to interact. It's going to be a good show. So, like I said, today we're going to talk about a cognitive bias called selective perception. Now, selective perception is the tendency to sort of interpret and sort of filter your perception of neutral events that don't necessarily have a spin, but what you see in that particular event is what you're inclined to see. You interpret it a certain way because of your pre-existing prejudices and preconceived notions about the way things are. To give you an example, if you've ever heard someone referred to as having their mind in the gutter or a dirty mind that constantly sees dirty jokes in literally everything, even if it's innocuous, that would be an extreme example of a selective perception, where every single piece of information that goes into their mind is tried to be contextualized in the sense of being, bawdy, I guess is a good word for it. But that's an extreme example because really all of us have selective perceptions to varying degrees about a variety of subjects. And that's what we're going to talk about today is, as professionals and business people, how this bias affects us and how we can account for it and maybe do a little better for ourselves, plus how to use it to get more sales and increase customer loyalty and that kind of thing. Because as we said, it's a cognitive bias. You can think of it sort of as a programming flaw in the human brain that we all have in common. Another way you can think of selective perception and how different people can look at the exact same event and it's contextualized in their mind in two entirely different ways is a very simple one to think of as a sporting event. Everybody watches the same game, but the meaning of the game, the impact, your emotional response, your perception, your interpretation of what happened is going to be entirely different depending on which team you support, or if you don't really care about either team. These things are going to completely change the way you view and interpret and even remember this particular event later on. It's going to heavily change the way that this particular event has any significance in your life whatsoever, or if it does at all. If you are a fan of the show, you may have watched a few weeks ago, we talked about something called confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is similar to selective perception. In fact, it might even be, you can think of confirmation bias as a kind of selective perception. But confirmation bias has to do with people picking only sources and pieces of information that already validate the way they already feel and believe, and tend to ignore and forget about other things. Selective perception is more that if an event is ambiguous and doesn't necessarily have a spin or context, people will sort of project their own interpretation onto it based on what they already believe. I mentioned just now memories are subject to selective perception. We've talked about in previous shows how the current thinking of the way the human memory works, contrary to how it may feel to you, is that your brain is not recording video files that you can go back and replay. What happens is when you call up a memory of an event and try to remember vivid detail about it, your brain is going to play back what it remembers, but it's also using your imagination and other memories to fill in gaps that it doesn't quite save. So literally every time you recall a new memory in vivid detail as time rolls into the future, that memory is going to change because your brain is unconsciously editing it every time you think of it. This is where selective perception comes in, because you are going to, over time, tend to contextualize your memories in the context of how you currently feel. So if you feel like you had a bad childhood or something, every time you go back and think about memories of your childhood, that perception is going to color the way that you remember it, and your brain will tend to fill in things in such a way that those memories become more and more difficult and bad for you because they're being edited towards that point of view over and over again because of this bias, right? But the same thing can happen in a positive way. So like if you had a bad time in high school, say, but you have a much better life later in life and you feel like, you know, being picked on or whatever maybe made you a better person. Now, because of that positive attitude, when you look back at your high school years, you may think of it in a different way than you thought of it at that time. And that will color the way that you recall those memories. So obviously there's a lot of potent interactive brain stuff happening around this idea of selective perception, because it has to do with, almost you can think of it as like an editor in a TV studio, and the show is happening live out there in front of you, but your brain is sitting there saying, okay, camera one, okay, camera two, okay, cut away from that guy. Now look at that audience member who's smiling. It's sort of your brain editing the information as it comes in. And then every time you bring it up, it's like George Lucas in the Star Wars movies. Every time he touches it, he wants to fuck with it and change it in a way that may be entirely unnecessary, but it's important to him. And that happens in your own brain. And the reason we call it a mistake is because people don't realize that they're editing that information as it comes in. They feel like the way they interpret it is the way to interpret it, and they have trouble believing anyone with any sense would look at it any other way. Hopefully everyone's following so far. We're going to move on to talk about so for people in the Cult of Copy audience, generally they are freelancers or entrepreneurs, people involved in business in some degree, because they are using what we talk about to, you know, increase sales and customer loyalty and that kind of thing, right? Typical marketing, persuasion, and influence stuff. Now, when you're in that position, a lot of times people talk about the difference between an entrepreneurial, if you're listening to the audio only version, I'm doing quotey fingers there. Entrepreneurial mindset is different than the normal person's mindset. And, you know, people talk about different things you can do to shift your mindset and blah, blah, blah. And really all this talk about mindset is about selective perception, right? So if you are looking to be an entrepreneurial kind of person, if you're looking to be a better freelancer, someone who basically creates their own positive situations in the world and then tries to leverage those versus just being an employee or working for another company, that kind of thing, it is valuable to you for you to shift your mindset so that you are practicing looking for the opportunities in a given situation instead of just passively taking in the situation or coloring it a certain way because of your own values and mindset. So a way to think about this is lots of small business owners I know, politically in America anyway, lean on the financially conservative side politically, right? So They don't want a lot of taxation. They want less regulation. They want the country and its laws to favor their businesses and favor them in such a way that they are allowed to thrive or even given benefits that make them thrive, right? Anything that's got like any socialist bent, taking from everybody for the greater good of everybody, anything like that sort of goes against their grain in the political language of the country today. But I want you to consider an idea. If your goal was to be a profitable entity, you should develop strategies that take advantage of all of those mindsets, right? Like, you don't want to look at a given event and think, oh, this is terrible for my business. You want to think, okay, well, this is an event that happened. How can I flip this into an opportunity that I can leverage to my advantage? Now, a lot of times people can't turn off their personal bias because they're not even aware that it's happening. But if you are aware that selective perception is a thing, anytime you see some event in the news, some event happens locally, maybe something happens within your own business that you think of as a negative, something that's going to have a bad impact, instead of accepting that immediate response, think, okay, well, is it just my experience and my memory that's sort of coloring this event? Can I look at it objectively? Maybe even can I talk with a buddy about this to try and look at it objectively in a way where I can flip this into an opportunity? Another woo-woo sort of positive thinking motivational meme thing that goes around is all this talk about gratitude, which is especially relevant today because in America we just had Thanksgiving yesterday. So gratitude is on everyone's mind. Although today is Black Friday, which is where, Americans will trample people to death to get material things at a discount, when yesterday they just allegedly spent all day being thankful for what they already have. But that's none of my business. What I'm talking about is this idea that getting in the habit of expressing gratitude can actually kickstart this idea of seeing opportunities in more places, right? Because if you come from a place where you're constantly thinking about what you're thankful for first, it minimizes your tendency to look to shortfalls and bad outcomes that happen randomly because the universe is a cold and uncaring place that doesn't care about your dreams. Bad things happen, right? So when bad things randomly happen, if you're already in the habit of being grateful for things that you already have, having a positive attitude about what's happening in your life, it can shift your perspective so that you are focusing on the positive, so that when negative things happen, you don't automatically look at them in a negative light, and you're more likely to be able to figure out how to extract positivity or at least minimize the negativity when it occurs. So I thought that was interesting because I'm not one for these woo-woo motivational metaphor memes. That doesn't really float my boat. But I thought it was an interesting way to look at it, because really what that is about, if you use them earnestly, as sort of a meditative exercise instead of like, clicking like on a meme someone made, that's part of this positive perception change. You are changing your own selective perception by choosing consciously the way that you're going to look at situations instead of just letting whatever bad baggage you have kick in automatically. Another way that this can actually be beneficial for media sort of creators, like most internet marketers and internet-based businesses are today, is this idea that you can look at information and content from any source and look at it through the lens of whatever it is you're supposed to be an expert in, and create a message that creates value in your marketplace by applying that simple twist. By looking through those glasses of expertise, you can take an otherwise ambiguous event and present it specifically as something that has to do with your own market. Now, if you're a member of the Cult of Copy Facebook group, you may have seen me posting a lot of quotation memes. They're not meant to be inspirational, though. I tend to pick ones that are intended to start conversations and ones that I can position to be somewhat controversial and get people to think in a way that they don't normally think. What I'm actually trying to do there is do what I'm talking about here, is use and apply my own selective perception to take quotes out of context from people who died, hundreds of years ago, and see how I can apply it to what it is that I care about and talk about today. How can I look through my lens of being a, professional persuasion expert, blah, 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 cult leader, and look at this content and create a particular interpretation of it. And then I share that interpretation with my audience, because the trick is, when someone has this selective perception, they don't know they have it. And it's really hard to get people to change their mind and look at something in a different way, because in a way, you're basically telling them you're looking at this wrong, right? And no one likes to think that their brain is working incorrectly. They certainly don't like to be told that by other people. So what this is allowing you to do is, instead of telling them that they're wrong, you're simply giving them another way to look at it. Like, you can't change the way someone's eyeballs work, but you can lend them your glasses. So if you're creating this perception and looking at the world a certain way, and you give people a way to look through your eyes at the world around you, they're going to tend to start putting those glasses on more and more, and eventually they change their selective perception to match yours, if when they do that, it equals something positive for them. So that may seem like a little esoteric or whatever, but think about, if you operate in a certain market and it's beneficial to you for the customers in that market to have a certain perception about big events that may be happening in that marketplace, new innovations, new products coming out, new advances, or maybe new regulations, things that might hurt them. They need someone to interpret that stuff for them. And if you're the person to go out there and use your selective perception to create this valuable perspective that they can then adopt voluntarily, you sort of get to control the way people look at the market the bigger your audience grows, right? This is something you see happen as different 24-hour news networks with different perspectives on interpretation of world events. As their market share changes, as different people pay attention to different ones, it changes the national conversation about what these events mean and how they're relevant to us day by day. And again, if you have any questions or comments or anything, dump them into the comment box. Zane is keeping an eye on it, and he will interrupt if there's anything I can add to the conversation.
No, I was actually just going to say a bunch of people just showed up, so now's a good time. I was just going to say that shifting perception sounds cooler than changing mindset, but that's just my selective perception.
Exactly. Like, it's one of those things where you can get someone to open their selective perception up to being edited, or at least reconsidered, if you can phrase it in such a way that it doesn't kick their selective perception in. So, for example, I've told this story, I think, on the show before. This guy, Edward Bernays, who's considered like the father of modern advertising, he's the first guy to sort of bring psychology into marketing. He got into business and doing advertising when he came back to America after World War I, where he had been a propagandist for the Allies. So he was used to using publication to manipulate popular opinion. And when he came back to the States, he wanted to do that for business. But by that time, propaganda, the word propaganda, had a negative connotation. So he invented the phrase public relations, which essentially is propaganda for business. But by creating the phrase public relations instead of using the word propaganda, he inadvertently also did the first act of public relations, because he changed the nomenclature of something that had a negative connotation so that he could still benefit from it, but it didn't have the negative connotations of the name. Because again, selective perception would have made people look at propaganda as a negative automatically, instead of thinking how the same methods could apply to even an ethical and positive business. Just because the bad guys use a certain technique doesn't mean the technique itself is bad. You can use a hammer to hit someone over the head with, but you can also use the same hammer to build a house. Just because some people use it as a weapon doesn't mean it's an evil tool. So, that being said, let's move on to sort of the traps that entrepreneurs and people in our line of work can fall into when it comes to selective perception, because we talked about ways that you can improve your selective perception to your benefit. But some of the traps are, again, I don't want to use this phrase in a way that makes you think I'm super into the woo woo talk around it. But you hear a lot of people talk about scarcity mindedness versus abundance mindedness, right? So this, again, I don't really care for the like, oh, just change your mindset, whatever. But the idea that these two different attitudes towards interpreting the content of the world, the reason that distinction exists is because we're talking about a difference in selective perception. So if you have the kind of point of view where, the world is unfair to you, the world is somehow giving other people advantages that you don't get, if you feel like random occurrences in the marketplace favor other people but they'll never favor you, these are all biases, right? And we fall into that because we tend to take the entire world personally when really it's not. So I again I I don't want to sound like one of these motivational type people, but you want to be aware of when you think from the scarcity mindset, when you have a negative reaction to what is a neutral event that doesn't care what someone's position is, it just happened. Instead of looking at it as a detriment, even if it's going to have some short-term consequences for you, try and look at it from the point of view, how can you fix this? Or this happened to a bunch of people. How can I get together with those people and help so we all come out ahead, right? That's a way to start seeing opportunity where previously you were seeing negativity and bad things happening, right? Now, the show itself, the Cult of Copy show, this whole like improving your mindset as an entrepreneur is not really our bag. That's not really what we typically talk about. But in this case, for this bias, I know it's something we suffer from particularly. So I wanted to talk about it for at least a little while. Now we're going to get into how to use selective perception to persuade more strangers and prospects into buying more stuff from you. And then once you already have customers, how to use selective perception to make them more loyal and make them repeat customers for as long as possible. So when you're talking about prospects, the prospect's point of view when they first encounter you, if you're a stranger, is that you are one of many competitors offering similar products and services. And as far as they know, there's no distinction, right? Most people, when they're marketing their business, think about how to make their business look better. What are the positives that apply to my business? But the trick with selective perception is that it's very wide. Perception is very wide. So when they're considering you and you're only listing off your positives, that compares against all the other competition in your field. So what I think you should do instead is be aware of that and figure out what the big, broad negatives across your entire industry are and how your business is different in relation to that. Because then what you're doing then is not affecting one little tiny piece of their perception, which is your business compared against 10, 20, 100 other competing businesses. That's a tiny little blip on the radar. But if you can call out these giant, erroneous, negative things going on in your market that apply to many, many competitors, and then show yours as being opposed to that, now that mental blip on their mental radar becomes much, much, much bigger, much brighter, much more visible, right? Because what you're doing is you're changing their ability to perceive everything. It's like you're drawing a mustache on their TV so that everyone who shows up on the screen has a mustache or something, right? Like you're altering the way that they can see the competition when you point out these negatives that exist, because then they'll start looking for them. And every competitor they look at that suffers from that flaw is now going to be seen in that light, whereas your business is not, right? So that's one way to apply it. Another way to apply it is, earlier in the show, I talked about how selective perception can alter your memories, because every time you bring up an instance to recall something, your brain rewrites parts of it that it doesn't have great detail on. It can do that using your memory of other things, excuse me, which is why sometimes
in your mind, two memories can sometimes get smashed together, and you remember two separate events as actually being part of the same event. Um, but the other thing that can affect memories when you call them up for subsequent recall is your imagination. So if you're telling a story to someone and you're asking them to recall a situation like their typical work day, and you hit on a lot of details like their drive to work in gridlock, getting into the office late and getting chewed out for it, spilling their lunch as they come into the office, or someone eating it out of the work fridge like a jerk, their manager coming in and calling an unnecessary meeting that makes them waste their whole morning and they don't get the work done they need to by lunch. So they end up working from their desk and having to stay late and blah, blah, blah. Any of these things, what you're doing is taking what's really like millions of combinations of different experiences day by day at this job, but now you're giving them this lens of negativity to look through that makes their daily work day look bad if you are offering them something that is like, start your own business. That's sort of the perception I'm talking about. But any product where you can give them that negative perception where they're remembering something from their past and you're making them focus in. Remember, you're like the director in the engineering bay of the live TV show. But now instead of a live show, you're bringing up that memory and you're re-editing it, you're recutting it. You're saying instead of zooming in on this, zoom in on that negative aspect. And now from now on, when they pull up that memory, or even when they're experiencing that same situation again, they go to drive to work tomorrow, their focus, their selective perception is now looking for the negative, which hopefully if you have a product that fixes that, now their desire for that product is increased because you've given them a different perspective. You changed the way that they can experience the world. So that's the way that you can sort of influence and manipulate and change people who are prospects, who are not familiar with you and your stuff. We're trying to get them to make that first sale. So we're agitating them. Now, I'm sort of presuming here that your product is good and actually delivers results. I'm thinking that goes without saying, because when you push people and agitate them and then get them to buy, you want them to be relieved and satisfied, because that's the number one thing that's going to turn them into a repeat customer or a non-refunder at least. You want to deliver on the promises that you're making. So when I say you're making someone feel negative so that your product stands out as relief, that product better actually deliver relief, or else I don't want to really be your friend. But be aware that whether or not the product is quality at all, this persuasion stuff works on the front end. If the product quality is bad, that's something the prospect and you are going to have to deal with after the sale. But that's sort of irrelevant to the idea of what we're doing to push people into making that decision in the first place.
So in a way, you and the Cult of Copy offer people like us content, different types of filters, like, hey, try this filter and try this filter, because it can affect the overall feeling of the prospect, right?
Yeah, I mean, really, when I started the cult, the idea was everyone creating content for marketers to learn from was themselves like an active marketer with a reputation to protect. So no one who like wants to get hired as a copywriter will necessarily tell you know what you should study? Con artists. like no one wants to, cult leaders, those guys got persuasion down. Televangelists, well, we have these conversations behind the scenes, but no one's really going to talk about that stuff in public, even though those guys are masters of persuasion. But again, it's actually your selective perception that's like, oh, those guys are criminals. I can't look at them. They got nothing to offer me. I'm going to, everyone thinks Star Wars is real. And if you look at the dark side, you're going to get red eyes and turn evil all of a sudden, right? Like if you even think about it. But trust me on this, if you are a smart person, it is entirely possible to entertain an idea and examine it without it affecting your actual behavior. Like you're not that susceptible, right? So
what I wanted real food for thought.
Yeah. So what I wanted to do was create a place where marketers could look at this stuff and not get judged for wanting to look at the dark side, with the idea being we grab what's in the dark side and drag it over into the light, because there's no good reason to let evil people be the only ones who use this stuff, right? Because it's very effective. And as long as you have the prospect's best interest at heart, no one's ever going to be like, man, I bought this product. You were right. It changed my life. Everything's 100% better. But I wish you hadn't tricked me into buying it. You know, like very rarely, if at all, is someone going to say something like that. And if they do say something like that, they're crazy. You know, like everyone is thankful that you push them as hard as you possibly could into doing something that actually helps them.
If anything, you get more of a, I see what you did there, but I love it.
Yeah, exactly. So moving on from that, that's how you leverage this against people who have never heard of you. Now, when it comes to having an audience, a recurring audience, people who have heard of you and you want them to come back for more, over time, the more you publish content, like I talked about those quotes I was doing, or even just any post I do inside the Cult of Copy discussion group, over time, the audience's perception shifts because I keep giving them new perspectives to consider. And every little bit of that they internalize and want to use, they start looking at the world the way that I do. They start seeing things through my eyes the way that I'm sort of asking them to, because I'm giving them the tools to replicate that. I'm not just saying, here's my interpretation of this event. I'm saying, put on your opportunity glasses and look at this. Put on your positive thinking cap and look at this negative situation and see what the benefits are, right? So over time, any audience that is connected with you and consuming your messages long term, be aware that when you present perspectives, you're actually shifting the way that they see things. They'll actually give you more and more authority to dictate their opinions to them, as long as everything you say makes sense and they can see it in their own lives. You're not contradicting anything that's coming in. The more stuff you tell them and the more they look around their own life, the more they're like, yeah, that is true. That is what I'm seeing. That is what I'm experiencing. And the more times you can do that, the more they're willing to just take anything you say as something they should consider, including when you say, hey, this product is good and it will help you, I think you should buy it. Which, as a business, that's kind of the whole reason you have them on a list anyway. Not to be crass, you know. So that's one way to do it. And then to dig in a little more, one of the ways that you can really more easily shift people's point of view to adopting yours more and more, because remember I said you can't change people's eyeballs. There's nothing I could tell you from me to you that's going to make you change the way you see the world in one setting, unless you have like a literal like religious experience, like lightning striking your head and you fall off your camel like that dude in the Bible. There's not a whole lot of situations where that actually happens in the real world. But when you get someone in a context where they consume repeated messages from you, you have the opportunity to do this. And the easiest way that I know to do this is actually part of the Viking Velociraptor quote message formula that I've taught inside the cult group. And I think we might even have done a show about it before. I use it all the time, literally in everything that I write. For sales messages and content messages, I use it over and over and over again. Part of that is when you want an audience to sync up, excuse me, with your point of view, or at least express a point of view to pull people out of a wider audience that would very much like your perspective and your content, you want to share values that your audience has in common with you. So if work-life balance is something that's important to you as like an entrepreneurial coach, you would put content out about that and how it applies to people, because it will attract people who care about that. And then the people who are already in your audience that are not big on that are going to open their mind up to it because it's coming from you. And they presumably like you for other reasons. So that would be an example of a value that you could share. But it can be anything. It could be like the sports team you like, the TV shows you like, the music you like, opinions about what's going on in your marketplace that swing one way or the other. It could be anything, but you want to share what matters to you, what drives you, why you're doing what you're doing, the things you have in common that make you a tribe on the inside, the way you feel, right? That's values. But the second thing that's even more potent, if you want to put this into your content to help make people sort of voluntarily help you shift their perspective. It's particularly insidious, and unfortunately, there are global events happening in the world right now that are bringing it to the forefront in what I think is a really negative way, is to use villains. You find villains that you and your audience have in common, and that it's particularly powerful if the threat is very vague and non-specific and hard to pin down, because then rampant speculation about what fearful situation might happen is something that you can use to make the audience cleave to you even more. Now, that's an extreme situation where you use fear of an enemy to get people to act a certain way and sort of collect around your point of view, right? This is a good example of what I'm talking about, where people select a perception because of what's happening in the world right now. You think I'm talking about terror, and I'm talking about the people who use terrorism in the news to create this fearful atmosphere, right? That's some pretty intense, heavy shit. So you might think, oh, I would never do something like that for my business. But this idea of using villains to help build an audience around you can be used in a positive way too. Because if you want something better for your customers in your marketplace, and you make villains out of the existing establishment in your market, whatever that may be, that's not serving them well, that's not doing good things for them, that's actually maybe hurting them, causing more harm than good, then it makes sense to make a villain out of them, to position yourself as someone who can help them, who can rescue them. Because a lot of times they know things are not good, and they don't realize there's any resistance or other way of doing things. They just sort of accept the bad way of doing things without realizing there's something different. The way to get their attention is to acknowledge, yeah, that it is bad. There are bad guys out to get you. Bad things are happening, but there's good news. We should talk about it. So that's a way that you can use selective perception and leverage it to get your ongoing audience to see things the way that you see, both to identify new positive opportunities and shared values in the world, but also things to look out for, enemies that you have in common, bad things. Using both of those makes whatever information you have for them stop being just a piece of information and start being something they can look through and interpret their world. And that's much, much more powerful than just giving them a piece of information by itself to decide one way or the other what it means to them. When you do the looking for them and you give them the perception, the more of those pieces they pick up from you, the more influence you have over their overall selective perception. This is why gurus and cult leaders and, even, positive, valuable people, teachers who like generations of students love, this is what those people did for those audiences. They shifted their selective perception so that the world literally seems different because of the time that they spent interacting with this person. Obviously, you should see why this is a very powerful thing you can do. That's it for this week's show. We've gone a little long. That's fine. They don't all have to be the same length. Last week's episode was short. We're just making up the difference. So I'm going to go through my little closing spiel. If you have any questions or comments or anything, you're watching the show, please do leave them for Zane. I love having the little interactive bits on the show. Leave that with him. He'll interrupt me at the end when I'm done. And I'm going to talk now about what we're going to do next week. So as I said, I'm your host, the Reverend Dr. Sir Colin D. Theriault of the Cult of Copy. We record new episodes live Thursdays. I'm sorry, we used to do Thursdays. It's Fridays at 2 p.m. Eastern. Next week's episode, which I would like you to join us for, is going to be about the pseudo-certainty effect. And the pseudo-certainty effect is when you tend to want to pursue the less risky possibility unless both outcomes that you can choose from are uncertain, and then you're more likely to take the risky one. So for example, if I say, here's two choices, you can definitely get X, or on this circumstance, you have a 20% chance of getting X versus an 80% of not. When you look at that situation, of course, most people are going to pick the certain one. But if I give you two choices where I'm like, you can have 80% chance of getting X and 20% chance of getting nothing, or 70% chance of getting Y and 30% chance of getting nothing, the mind has trouble determining against those two because they're both ambiguous. So people will mostly pick the one that's less risky. If that seems too complicated, I know some of this stuff can get pretty esoteric, but I promise there's very, very valuable and powerful ways you can apply the pseudo certainty effect. And we'll also actually talk about the certainty effect because you can use both of those in your marketing to make more money. So I hope you'll join us next Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern, right here at the Cult of Copy channel, youtube.com/Cult of Copy. You can follow our website at cultofcopy.com or join our Facebook group, which is at facebook.com/group/Cult of Copy. Any questions before we call it a day, Zane?
No questions, but I got to say, I got a lot of value out of it. I had a great time.
Yeah, man. I could tell when I was putting together the notes for this show it was going to be a good one because a lot of leverage in this one for both your own life and affecting the lives of the people whose money you take in exchange for giving them something of value. So if you like this show, like I said, we have 29 previous episodes archived in the YouTube channel, and you can join us next week live if you want. Interact with us anytime we record new episodes, and we'll see you there. We'll call it a day. Have a great weekend, everybody, and happy Thanksgiving to my American friends. Adios.